My name is Jesse Collard, and I was 26 years old the night my father told me I was done in this family. He said it at the dinner table. Not quietly, not privately, at the dinner table with my stepmother and my two younger half-siblings sitting right there, with the good dishes out because it was a Sunday, with the kind of calm that people use when they've already decided something and are just informing you of it. He said, "The fire department is embarrassing. You had every advantage I could give you, and you chose this. You're done in this family." I pushed back my chair. I stood up. I didn't say anything. I walked out of that house, and I drove home in the dark, and I sat in my apartment for a long time before I turned any lights on. The thing my father never understood, the thing he couldn't have known because he had stopped paying attention to anything about my life the moment I chose it, was that I had already been doing this work for 2 years, and in those 2 years something had happened that no one in that dining room knew about. Something documented. Something that already existed on paper in an office, with a name on it. My name. 2 years after that dinner, my father sat in the front row of a ceremony he hadn't been invited to attend. What happened in that room is the reason I'm telling you this. Welcome back to Last Regret, where quiet people let the record speak before they do. If this one resonates, drop a comment. And if you're new, subscribe before the next story drops. My father made his money in commercial insurance. Not in the dramatic way that people sometimes make money. Not through a single stroke of luck or a bet that paid off or an inheritance that arrived at the right moment. He built it the way certain people build things, methodically, patiently, over 30 years, through a brokerage firm he had founded in his early 30s in a city called Varenport, which sat on the eastern edge of a region where industrial and maritime businesses were dense enough that commercial insurance was not a peripheral industry, but a central one. By the time I was a teenager, my father's firm had 42 employees and a client portfolio that included 3 of the largest port operators in the region. He was not famous. He was not the kind of rich that gets written about. He was the kind of rich that accumulates quietly, that shows up as a certain quality of house and a certain quality of car, and a certain ease in rooms where ease costs money to maintain. His name was Douglas Collard, and he was, in most of the ways that mattered to him, a man who had done what he set out to do. What he had set out to do, in broad terms, was build a life that looked like the one he had admired from the outside when he was growing up without money in a mid-sized city, with very specific ideas about what success meant. He had done this. He had done it thoroughly, and at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, but I suspect it was around the time his first marriage ended and he remarried and started the second half of his life with my stepmother, Renata. The doing of it had become so complete that the having of it was all that remained, and the having of it required maintenance, which required everything around him to confirm and reinforce what he had built. That included his children. I was the eldest, from the first marriage. My mother, whose name was Caroline, had divorced my father when I was 9, and I had grown up primarily with her in a smaller city about 40 minutes south of Varenport, spending alternate weekends and 6 weeks of every summer with my father and, after my father remarried when I was 13, with my father and Renata, and eventually with my father and Renata, and my half-siblings Marcus and Delia, who arrived in successive years and who were, and I say this without resentment because it's simply true, more fully his than I was, in the sense that they had grown up inside the life he'd built rather than adjacent to it. My father had plans for me that I understood even before he articulated them. The plans were legible. University, a degree in something useful, a path into a profession that had a clear architecture of advancement and a clear ceiling that was high enough to be respectable. Law was fine. Finance was fine. Engineering was fine. He had never said the words directly, but the implication was consistent enough over enough years that I could have written it out myself. You take the foundation I've provided, and you build something on top of it that confirms the foundation was worth providing. I understood the plan. I didn't argue with it during the years, when arguing would have been premature. What I did instead was go to university as planned, study business administration as planned, and spend 4 years becoming incrementally more certain that the life the plan was building toward was not one I wanted to be living when I was 40. This is a thing that happens to some people in their early 20s, a growing gap between the trajectory they're on and the one that feels true, not dramatic, not rebellious, just quietly, persistently misaligned. I wasn't unhappy at university. I wasn't performing some kind of quiet crisis. I was just paying attention to what made me feel present versus What made me feel like I was rehearsing for something I'd agreed to before I understood the terms. What made me feel present was, of all things, a volunteer shift I picked up in my third year. The university had a community service program that offered course credit for approved volunteer placements, and one of the placements on the list was with the city's fire service, specifically with their community outreach division, doing fire safety education in schools and community centers. I signed up because the schedule fit, and the credit was useful, and I had no particular expectations one way or the other. The first day I walked into Varenport Station 7, something shifted that I did not immediately have language for. It wasn't the equipment or the trucks or anything visual, though all of that was present. It was something about the quality of attention in the room, the way the people in that station existed in relation to each other and to their work, a kind of stripped-down purposefulness that had no performance in it, no maintenance of appearances, no gap between what they were doing and why they were doing it. They were there to do a job that had real stakes, and the stakes organized everything else, and the organization felt, to me, like something I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. I finished the volunteer placement. I signed up for another. By the end of my third year, I had completed more than 200 hours at Station 7, and the crew supervisor, a woman named Lieutenant Priya Mehta, had told me twice that if I was serious about the service, I should apply when I graduated. I graduated. I applied. I was accepted into the Varenport Fire Department's recruit training program at 24 years old, and I completed training and received my posting to Station 11 on the east side of the city at 25. I told my father in a phone call. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than a pause and shorter than a silence. Then he said, "Jessie, you have a business degree." "I know," I said. "You have a business degree, and I have 40 people who would take you tomorrow."
40.
"You could walk in Monday." "I know that too, Dad." Another pause. "This is a phase," he said, and the confidence in his voice when he said it was the particular confidence of a person who is already preparing their response to the next thing and has filed this thing as temporary.
"It's not a phase," I said.
"We'll talk at Christmas," he said. I reported to Station 11 the following week. The person who understood what I had decided, who had, in some ways, seen it coming before I had, was my grandfather on my mother's side, a man named Robert Palliser, who had spent 28 years as a wildland firefighter in the mountain regions of the West before a knee injury retired him at 53 to the small town of Creston Flats, about 60 miles from Varenport, where he lived in a house with a vegetable garden and a shop full of tools, and a habit of waking before sunrise that he had never been able to break. My grandfather Robert was 73 years old when I joined the department, and he had the compact, deliberate quality of a man who had spent most of his life in physical work and had not softened much in retirement. He called things what they were. He did not hedge. He had watched my father with the careful neutrality of a man who knows that criticizing a person's son-in-law, even after the divorce, costs more than it returns, but he had watched me closely enough over enough years to know the difference between what I was told I was and what I actually was. When I called him the week I was accepted into the recruit training program, he picked up on the second ring and listened to me tell him without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What took you so long?" I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed about any of it. "The business degree," I said. "The business degree," he repeated in the tone people use when repeating something that doesn't require comment to be understood. Robert had been to Station 7 with me twice during my volunteer year. He had talked with Lieutenant Mehta for 40 minutes during the second visit about air management protocols and the changes in thermal imaging technology since his time, and Mehta had told me afterward that my grandfather knew more about wildland-urban interface tactics than half the training instructors she'd worked with. I was not surprised. Robert had spent 28 years in a discipline that required the same stripped-down purposefulness I had noticed at Station 7, and he had never left it behind entirely even when he left the work. In the 2 years between my hiring and the dinner at my father's house, Robert was the person I called after difficult shifts. Not to report what had happened. There are things that happen on calls that you don't carry into phone calls, that you process with your crew, or with the resources the department provides, or in the quiet of your own recovery, but just to talk. To be in a conversation with someone who knew the weight of the work without needing it explained. He had been in that weight for 28 years. He understood its specific gravity. He also kept a record. In his shop on the wall beside the workbench where he built furniture in retirement, There was a corkboard that had been there for years, the kind that accumulates layers, with old things pinned underneath new things, a visible archaeology of whatever he had thought was worth saving. In the 2 years since I joined the department, a section of that corkboard had become mine. He had printed and pinned the department's formal appointment letter. He had pinned the certificate from my recruit training graduation. He had pinned a photograph from a residential fire response where I was visible in the background carrying equipment. My mother had sent it to him after seeing it in the local paper. I hadn't known it existed until he mentioned it. I asked him once why he kept those things. He looked at the corkboard for a moment and then looked back at me. "Same reason I keep the rest of it," he said. "Because it happened and it matters and someone should know it." I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded, and we went back to the project he had been working on, which was a dining table he was building from reclaimed oak, and we worked in the shop for the rest of the afternoon without talking much, which was one of the things I valued most about being with him. The dinner at my father's house happened on a Sunday in early March, 14 months after I joined Station 11. My father had been asking me to come for the better part of 2 months, not with urgency, not with anything that felt like a setup, just the regular quarterly invitation to Sunday dinner at the Varenport house that he extended to me and that I usually accepted because my half-siblings Marcus and Delia were there, and I liked them and didn't want my relationship with my father to cost me the relationship with them. I drove up from my apartment in the southeast quarter of the city on a clear afternoon, parked in the wide driveway of the house, a large, stone-faced colonial on a street where every house was a large, stone-faced colonial, and rang the bell because I had never been given a key to the second marriage house, a fact I had long since stopped thinking about consciously, but which announced itself briefly every time I stood on that step. Renata answered the door. She was pleasant, as she almost always was, in the way of someone who has made a sustained effort to manage a complicated situation gracefully and has largely succeeded. She asked about my drive. I said it was fine. Marcus, who was 17, appeared briefly in the hallway, said hey, and disappeared back upstairs. Delia, who was 14, was at the kitchen island doing homework and waved without looking up. Dinner was roast chicken and the kind of side dishes that appear at Sunday dinners in houses with household help. My father was at the head of the table. He had been in good spirits when I arrived, talking about a contract his firm had just renewed, about a golf trip he and Renata were planning, about Marcus's college visits. The conversation stayed in those registers through most of the meal, and I ate and answered questions and watched the table, and everything was, as it usually was, fine on the surface and carefully organized around what was not being said. It was after the main course, in the same middle-of-the-meal lull that seems to invite these things, that my father set down his fork and looked at me with the particular quality of attention that meant he had been building to something. "I got a call from a man named Gareth Forsyth last week," he said. "He's a client, but he's also on the board of the Varenport Medical Foundation. They're looking for someone to run their development office. Mid-level, maybe 3 years before you'd be in line for the directorship." He paused. "I put your name forward. He's willing to meet." I looked at my father across the table. "I'm not looking for a position in development," I said. "I have a job." "Jesse." He said my name the way you say a word you've been holding for a while. "You've been in that station for over a year. You've established that you can do it. That's fine. That's worth something. But you have a degree, you have every advantage I could give you, and Gareth Forsyth is willing to take a meeting because of me. That doesn't come twice." "I'm not going to take the meeting, Dad." The temperature in the room changed. Not loudly. The way it changes when something that has been carefully maintained stops being maintained. "Why not?" he said, and his voice was still even, still measured, the voice of someone conducting a reasonable conversation. "Because I don't want to work in development. Because I didn't become a firefighter as a placeholder while I waited for something else. This is what I do." My father looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked back at me, and the evenness in his face had shifted into something harder and more final. "The fire department is embarrassing," he said. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? I have 40 years of work in this city. I have a reputation, I have clients, I have relationships that took decades to build. And my son who I paid for, who I invested in, is a city employee who rides a truck. That is not what I built toward. That is not a story I can tell." Renata was looking at her plate. Marcus had gone still in the way teenagers go still when they realize something is happening that is not for them. Delia had stopped doing her homework. "I'm not asking you to tell it," I said. "You don't have to ask," he said. "It tells itself every time someone asks about you." He paused. "I put your name forward to Gareth Forsyth. Call him, take the meeting, or don't. That's your decision. But I want you to understand that if you choose to stay where you are choosing to walk away from everything I've tried to do for you. You're done in this family." He said it levelly, not loudly. "The way you state a policy." I sat with that sentence for a moment. Then I pushed back my chair. I stood up. I picked up my glass and carried it to the kitchen and set it by the sink, which was the thing I did at family dinners because Renata had asked me once, years ago, not to leave glasses on the table. Then I got my jacket from the hall closet, said goodnight to no one in particular. Marcus said goodnight back, quiet and a little uncertain, and walked out the front door. I drove home in the dark.
I did not call my father that week.
I did not call him the week after. He did not call me. I went to work. I ran calls. I came home. I ate. I slept when I could sleep, and lay awake when I couldn't. I called my mother on a Saturday morning and told her what had happened, and she was quiet for a long time, and then said that she was sorry, and I said I was all right, which was partly true. I called my grandfather Robert on a Sunday evening and told him the same, and he listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "He'll come around or he won't. You know which of those two things you can control."
"One of them," I said. "One of them," he said.
I went back to work. I need to tell you about the Hartley Road fire, because without it nothing that comes after makes sense. It happened in the early hours of a Wednesday morning, 8 months after the dinner at my father's house. Hartley Road was a mixed residential and light commercial corridor on the east side of Varenport, 2 miles from Station 11, the kind of street that has been there long enough that the buildings are a layered record of different eras, a row of narrow Victorian-era townhouses that had been converted to apartments sitting beside a 1960s commercial block sitting beside newer construction. All of them sharing walls or near sharing walls in the way that older urban streets accumulate rather than
plan.
The call came in at 2:40 in the morning. A fire in one of the converted townhouses, 3 stories, 6 apartments, all occupied. Station 11 arrived 4 minutes after dispatch. I'm not going to describe the fire in detail because that's not what the story is about, and because there are things from that night that belong to the crew and not to a public accounting. What I will tell you is this. When we arrived, there were people on the upper floors who could not get out. There were 2 of them. A man on the 2nd floor who had gotten to his window but could not get to the stairs, and a woman on the 3rd floor with her 12-year-old son who had barricaded in the bathroom because the corridor outside their door was already involved. I went in. I am not telling you this to make myself a hero. Every person on that crew went in, did their job, made their decisions. What I am telling you is what the citation would later say, because what the citation says is relevant to everything that follows, and I want you to have the facts as they were documented rather than as I experienced them, because the documented version is the one that mattered to the outcome of the story. The citation, which was issued by the Varenport Fire Department's Meritorious Service Review Board and signed by the Fire Commissioner, noted the following: that firefighter Jesse Collard, responding to a report of multiple trapped occupants in a fully involved structure, entered the building through the 2nd floor window access point with deteriorating visibility conditions, located and assisted the evacuation of 1 occupant on the 2nd floor, re-entered the structure after a roof partial collapse that required a full crew withdrawal, navigated to the 3rd floor bathroom location using thermal imaging and voice contact, and successfully evacuated both remaining occupants through an exterior ladder access prior to the collapse of the 3rd floor interior corridor. It also noted that all 3 occupants survived. The citation was filed. The review board conducted its process. I went back to work. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell anyone in my family on his side. I hadn't spoken to my father since the dinner 8 months earlier, and I was not going to reach across 8 months of silence to report something about myself. That was not how I operated, and beyond that, it felt wrong in a way I didn't have precise language for, like claiming something that hadn't finished becoming itself yet, offering it before it had settled into what it was going to be. My grandfather Robert knew, because Lieutenant Mehta had called him. She had my grandfather listed as an emergency contact. a formality I had included on the paperwork without much thought, and she called him after the incident to let him know I was all right, which was a kindness I would not have thought to ask for, but which I was glad of when he told me about it. He had driven to Varenport the following Saturday, and we had gone out to breakfast, and he had looked at me across the table the way he looked at structural problems, carefully, without rushing, and then he had said, "Good work," and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Several months after the incident, the department announced the date and venue for the annual Meritorious Service Ceremony, at which the citations issued during the prior year would be read and awarded. The ceremony was held at the Varenport Convention Center. It was a public event. It was announced in the regional paper. Attendance was open with registration. My grandfather registered. My mother registered. Several members of my crew registered. My father's firm, as it happened, was a long-standing corporate sponsor of the Varenport Public Safety Foundation, which co-hosted the ceremony. My father received an invitation by virtue of that sponsorship, one of 8 reserved seats in the front row, which were allocated to the event's principal sponsors. I knew this because the department's events coordinator, going through the registration list 2 weeks before the ceremony, had mentioned to Lieutenant Mehta that one of the sponsor table registrants shared my last name. Mehta had mentioned it to me. I did not call my father. I did not tell him what the ceremony was for. I did not send a message of any kind. I went back to work and waited for the date. The Varenport Convention Center's main hall seated 800, and the Meritorious Service Ceremony filled approximately half of that, 400 people, which was a substantial turnout for a civic event on a weekday evening in late autumn. The front section was arranged with reserved seating for honorees and their designated guests, and behind that, in the wider open seating, the room filled with crew members and family and the various civic and institutional figures who attended these things. The sponsor table was in the front row, stage left. 8 seats. I had been told which seat. I arrived with my mother and my grandfather Robert, who drove up from Creston Flats in the afternoon and who was wearing, for the first time I had ever seen, a dress shirt and jacket, which he had put on with the same matter-of-fact practicality he applied to everything, and which did not make him look dressed up so much as simply correct for the occasion. My mother had been quiet on the drive over, the particular quiet of someone who has things they want to say and is choosing the right time, which for my mother usually meant she would say them afterward rather than before. We found our seats. The hall filled. The house lights dimmed. I had been assigned to the honoree section, which was in the first 3 rows center. I was seated in the second row. From where I sat, I could see the sponsor table at the front left edge of the stage. My father was already seated when we arrived. He was in the 3rd seat from the left of the sponsor row, next to a man I recognized as one of his firm's senior partners. He was wearing a dark suit. He looked the way he always looked at civic events, composed, appropriately present, the posture of a man who attends these things as a professional obligation and is comfortable in that role. He did not look at the honoree section. Or, if he did, he didn't find me. Renata was not with him. I noted this without drawing a conclusion from it. The ceremony opened with remarks from the mayor, who spoke for 8 minutes about the department and its role in the city, and then from the chair of the Public Safety Foundation, who spoke for 5 minutes about the sponsorship program and the importance of civic partnership. Standard civic ceremony, carefully composed, appropriately formal, the kind of language that holds a room without asking much of it. Then the fire commissioner stepped to the podium. Commissioner Nadine Whitfield had been in the position for 6 years, and she had the quality that the best people in those positions have, an authority that doesn't announce itself, that exists in the room before she says a word, because it is built from something real. She was not theatrical. She did not work the room. She just stood at the podium and began to read, and when she read, you heard it. She read the citations in the order of the review board's calendar. There were 7 total that year. The first 3 were for a structural collapse response in which 2 engine crews had worked a 12-hour recovery operation. The 4th was a joint citation for a swiftwater rescue team. The 5th and 6th were administrative citations, 1 for a training officer, 1 for a prevention specialist. The 7th was mine. Commissioner Whitfield paused before she began it, not dramatically, not for effect, but with a slight shift in weight that means the reader has noted that what comes next requires full attention. She read the citation. I will not repeat it in full. What I will tell you is that she read it clearly and without abbreviation, which meant that the room heard every element of it: the time of the call, the conditions on arrival, the specific sequence of actions, the re-entry after the crew withdrawal, the thermal imaging navigation, the third floor evacuation. She read the names of the 3 occupants who had been evacuated. She read that all 3 had survived. Then she said, "Firefighter Jesse Collard, will you please come to the stage?" I stood up. As I moved from the second row toward the stage steps, I passed within 10 feet of the sponsor table. I did not look at it as I walked. But I have peripheral vision, and I know how to use it, and in the moment I passed that row, I registered my father's face. His head had come up from the program he had been holding, and he was looking at the stage, and his expression was, the only word I have for it is arrested. Like a man who has been moving through a room and has walked into a wall that was not there a moment ago. His mouth was not open. His hands, which had been holding the program loosely in his lap, had stopped moving. The program had gone still. I walked up the stairs to the stage. Commissioner Whitfield shook my hand. She handed me the citation, a framed document, heavier than you'd expect from something that size, the kind of weight that means the institution behind it understands the weight of what it represents. She held my hand for a moment after the handshake in the way that people do when the handshake is not enough, but words are also not quite right. I thanked her. I turned to face the room. 400 people were looking at the stage. I said 3 sentences. I said that the work belongs to the crew, and I was accepting the citation on behalf of everyone at Station 11 who responded that night. I said that I was grateful to be in a service that takes the documentation of this work seriously, because documentation means the work is seen, and being seen matters. I said that I had a grandfather in the audience who had given 28 years to this work in the mountains, and who I hoped understood that what I had done was, in no small part, because of what he had modeled. I looked at the audience when I said that last part, and I found Robert's face in the 4th row center, and he was sitting very straight in his jacket, and his expression was doing something that it almost never did, which was that it was not doing anything to stop itself. I left the stage. I walked back to my seat. I did not look at the sponsor table. The ceremony continued for another 20 minutes. When it ended and the house lights came up, the room began the slow reorganization of people finding each other and moving toward the exits and the post-ceremony reception in the adjacent hall. My father found me at the reception. I was standing with my mother and Robert and 2 members of my crew, Tomas, who had been in the building with me that night, and our lieutenant, Priya Mehta, who had driven from Station 7 specifically for this. When I saw my father making his way across the room with the deliberate purposefulness of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the decision can reconsider itself. He stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a moment. He looked at Robert. He looked at Robert in a way that meant he recognized him from photographs or from my mother's descriptions, and there was something in that recognition that cost him something, though I couldn't have said exactly what. He looked back at me.
"Jesse," he said. "Dad," I said.
He had the program from the ceremony in his hand, folded once. He looked down at it briefly. "I didn't know the ceremony was for," he stopped. "I came because of the foundation's sponsorship. It's an annual obligation." "I know," I said. "I didn't know you would be," he stopped again. This was unusual. My father was a man who finished his sentences. "I didn't know about the incident." "I didn't tell you," I said. "No," he said. There was a pause. Tomas, beside me, had gone very still in the way crew members go still when they understand that something is happening that requires them to be somewhere else, and he touched my arm briefly and stepped away, and Mehta followed, and my mother took a small step back, without going anywhere. My grandfather Robert did not move. My father looked at Robert, and then he said something I had not expected him to say. He said, "You knew." Robert looked at my father without any particular expression. "I knew what Jesse told me," he said, which was what Jesse chose to tell. My father absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly. His hand, holding the folded program, tightened once and then relaxed. The commissioner said he paused. "She read the whole thing." "She did," I said. "3 people," he said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. 3 people, I said. He looked at the program in his hand. He looked at it for long enough that it became something more than looking, a man trying to locate himself in relation to something he had not expected to encounter. His shoulders, which in most rooms held themselves with the steady uprightness of a man accustomed to commanding his own space, had dropped, not dramatically, just enough that the change was visible if you knew what his normal posture looked like, which I did. "I said things at dinner," he said. He did not look up when he said it. "You did," I said. He stopped. "I was wrong." 3 words. He said them with the particular difficulty of a man who knows how to say difficult things in professional contexts, but has very little practice saying them to his own son. The words came out levelly. He was still, even in this moment, a man who governed his register, but under the levelness there was something that did not have a performance behind it. I looked at my father for a moment. "Okay," I said. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was not the closing of a distance. It was something more like an acknowledgement, a receipt, a note that the words had been heard and would be considered. My father understood this, I think, because he was a careful enough reader of rooms to know that okay for me in that moment was not permission or release or reunion. It was the door being left unlocked rather than opened. He nodded once. He extended his hand. I shook it. He said he would call. I said he could. He said goodnight to my mother. Their first exchange in several years, formal and brief, each of them managing the distance correctly. He looked at Robert one more time, and Robert looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, but something passed in that exchange that I understood even if I couldn't name it. Then my father turned and walked back across the room toward the exit, and I watched him go, and I turned back to my crew and my family and picked up the conversation where it had been before he arrived. He called on a Saturday morning 10 days after the ceremony. The conversation ran 45 minutes, which was longer than any phone call we had had in years, and longer than I had expected. He asked about the incident, specifically, carefully, the way he asked questions about risk models at work, with the underlying framework of someone trying to understand the actual variables rather than the surface narrative. I answered what I could answer. There are parts of calls that aren't mine to discuss in detail with people outside the department, and I said so, and he accepted this with more grace than I would have predicted. He asked about Station 11, how the crew worked, what the shift structure was, what the call volume was like on the east side. He asked about the department structure, how promotions worked, what the pathway looked like for someone who had been in for 2 years and who had received a meritorious citation. I told him. He listened. Near the end of the call, he said, "I told Gareth Forsyth he could find someone else." I didn't say anything immediately. "I should have done that before the dinner," he said. "I shouldn't have presented it the way I did. I had already decided what I wanted the answer to be, and I framed the conversation accordingly. That wasn't fair." "No," I said. "It wasn't." "I know." There was a pause. "Marcus wants to know if he can come to the station sometime," my father said. "He's been asking since the ceremony. Delia too, actually." Something about this, the specific concreteness of it, the 17-year-old who had sat at that dinner table and gone still, and was now asking to visit the station, landed in a way that the apology hadn't quite, because the apology was between my father and me, but this was something else. "Yeah," I said. "Tell them to come." My stepmother Renata called 3 days after that. Her call was shorter. She was not a person who used phone calls to process things. She was a person who used phone calls to say what she had decided to say, and what she said was that she had watched the ceremony on the Foundation's live stream and that she was glad I was all right and that she hoped I knew the house was still open to me. I told her I appreciated it. I meant it. My mother called my grandfather after she heard about my father's phone call, and Robert told me about this conversation later, with the dry economy he brought to reporting things. Your mother wanted to know if I was surprised. I told her I was not. He paused. Were you surprised? I thought about it. Not by the call, I said. By the Marcus thing. Robert nodded. The way he nodded when something confirmed what he had thought. That's the one that'll hold, he said. He was right. Marcus came to Station 11 with Delia 4 weeks later, on a Saturday when I was on shift. Lieutenant Mehta let them sit in the cab of the engine and walked them through the gear layout and the radio system, and Marcus asked 11 questions in 40 minutes and Delia asked 2 very good ones, and they stayed for 3 hours and left with a slightly dazed quality of people who have encountered something that doesn't match the image they had of it. My father dropped them off and picked them up. He didn't come inside. But as I walked Marcus and Delia to the parking lot and watched them get in the car, my father lowered his window and said, "Good station." I said, "Yeah, it is." He nodded. He drove away. I went back inside. Robert came to see me the following spring, driving up from Creston Flats on a Saturday with a thermos of coffee and no particular agenda, which was his standard mode of arrival. We drove out to the east side and walked a section of Hartley Road. He had asked to see it, specifically in the way he asked to see things he thought were worth understanding physically rather than through description. The townhouse had been rebuilt. New windows, new exterior, the kind of careful restoration that happens in older neighborhoods where the buildings are worth saving. I showed him where the access point had been on the second floor, the approximate location of the third-floor bathroom window, where the ladder had gone. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then he turned and looked at the building across the street, and then he looked at the sky, and then he looked back at the building. "Good work," he said, again, the same 2 words he had said at breakfast after the incident. "You said that already," I said. "It was true then," he said. "Still true." We stood there for a minute in the spring morning, in front of a building that looked like it had always looked that way, with no visible record of what had happened in it on a cold February night 2 years earlier, except for the slight newness of the window frames and the fresh paint on the exterior that you only noticed if you were looking for it. "Your dad," Robert said. "Not a question." "We're talking," I said. Slowly. "That's enough," he said. "Is it?" He thought about this with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "It's the right speed for what it is," he said finally. "You don't rush the rebuilding just because the demolition was fast." I thought about that on the drive back. I thought about it again that evening, sitting in my apartment with a citation framed on the wall of my home office. I had put it there after Robert suggested the drafting table, except I didn't have a drafting table. I had a desk and a wall, and the wall seemed right, and looking at it in the way you look at a thing that represents more than itself. The citation said what it said. It documented what had been done and by whom and to what outcome, in the precise, affectless language of institutional record-keeping that is more powerful for its affectlessness, because nothing in it requires you to believe it. It just states, "It just is." My father had not built that. He had not prevented it either, which was something he had tried to do and had failed, and the trying and the failing were part of the record too, just not in any document. What I carry from that period is not the grudge. I don't carry grudges well, they're too heavy for the work I do, and it's not the triumph, because the citation belongs to the 3 people who were in that building and to the crew that went in to get them, not to whatever narrative my family needed to run on the side. What I carry is something simpler. The knowledge that the work was worth doing before it was recognized, that I would have gone back in that building whether or not there was anyone in the front row of any ceremony watching, and that the going back is the thing, not the watching. The recognition is the record. The work is the reason. 2 years. A dinner table that a door closed on, a building that got rebuilt, and a front row seat my father didn't know he'd bought when he signed the sponsorship renewal. That's my story. A program folded in a hand that didn't know what it was holding, a citation read aloud to 400 people in a room that went quiet, and 2 words from my grandfather in a parking lot in spring. Same 2 words he'd said in February, same 2 words he'll probably say again, because some things don't need a 3rd word to be complete. There's a question I've thought about since that night in the convention center. If you had been in my position, 2 years of silence, a citation you never mentioned, a parent in the front row who didn't know, would you have told him beforehand, or would you have let the room do what rooms do? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.